All right. Today, I kind of want to talk about George Washington, and he is such a divisive figure nowadays. And some of that I understand, and some of it I don't agree with necessarily. I think we do too much when looking back in the past. We do too much revisionist history where anybody who does anything bad for our current time is judged on the current standards. And not to, I know this, it always goes back to he owned 500 slaves. And that's true. He did own 500 slaves. He was massively wealthy. He didn't necessarily need to have those slaves there. And he did release them upon his death, but still, he could have done more towards the abolitionist movement. That being said, the abolitionist movement, the whole idea like let's not own people, only really started in the early 1800s with Britain. That's where abolition as an idea, like maybe we shouldn't own human beings really took place, which is pretty it's pretty interesting. That's like way sooner than you think. You think this idea, I'm sure, i'm I'm positive that there have been movements and groups and people that wanted abolition that just never made it to the history books, but George Washington specifically owned a lot of land, he had a lot of money, and he could have done something really unprecedented. But regardless, I think George Washington's probably our best leader and probably the best president, and ironically for setting a lot of precedents. And I think you can't overstate how important it was, the things that he did, especially as he got into power on things specifically with the term limits. You cannot underrate how important that is, because you could look at somewhere like the Haitian Revolution, which is a very similar time period. They, instead of Britain, they broke away from France, and they it ended in anarchy. And you look at the Haitians today compared to what we, now I'm not saying we necessarily would have gone down that route, but say for somewhere even in South America. I mean, if you look at Bolivar and what and him and how he transformed those countries from Spanish dominion for the most part into their own states, Gran Colombia as he wanted it to be, and you look at them now compared to us today. Now you can make all these squabbles. You can say how terrible our country is and how all this has happened, but you can't deny. I mean, we could have turned if George Washington decides to become a king, which he could have, decides to basically make himself king in not only name but just get rid of term limits completely and just I'm just gonna rule, that our trajectory of our entire country is way different. I think everybody would agree in a worse way. Basically, we would have we would have ended in anarchy, just like all these other countries, and we probably would have led to more civil wars. Who knows? I mean, westward expansion. Who knows if we even get that far? And it's really important that people see the good in that, and how that is 100 times more important for the stability of our country. And the whole slave ordeal, the whole slave controversy, like, who knows what that would have done had he done that. We really can't see it throughout history. We can't tell what that would have, what type of path that would have gone down. Maybe, you know, the Union's a lot weaker in those days. You think the '80s, the 1780s, not 1980s, but the Union is way less strong. I'm thinking like the Federalist. I cannot remember what it's called, but um, the first iteration of the government is super weak and super ineffective at getting taxes and there's a chance if he tries to do something too ambitious like that. I mean, you think of the southern states that are so reliant and will become even more reliant on slavery, but still at this point are quite reliant on slavery. You think if those southern states, they could have seceded, you know? Like, are we really gonna, if say multiple states in the South disagree vehemently and are willing to fight, do we just, do the states just break up? Are we no longer united, so to speak? It's really hard to say because it's like, you don't know. You can't go down that path. And so in a weird way, George Washington putting it off helped stabilize the Union with a horrible institution of slavery. I think no, there's nobody who disagrees with that, and disagrees what he did is horrible in keeping those 500 slaves even till death. I mean, he could have. You do, on the other hand, you do think like, man, what if he tried to, what if he tried to set an example and say, let's get rid of slavery once and for all. I'm going to set free all 500 plus slaves of mine. That, I mean, that could have helped. Like, if that's really, if he was gonna do it, that's what he would have had to do. Is where he he tries to ban slavery and do that, but I mean, it's still George Washington. You really like, I really like George Washington, and I understand he's got flaws. But man, if you think he's Satan, if you think George Washington is just the worst person because of slavery, I mean, everybody, you're gonna look back in history and say every single person is horrible, and I just don't think that's the right way to look at it. You got to take people for where they are at the time. You know, um, it's like we shouldn't justify that he did those things, but those were what the times were like, and so we can understand those things. But I don't think we should hold him to like, you know, he made racist jokes in the 1800s. We should ban him now. Like, it's, we just go too far with how we look at things, and you gotta judge on a curve. You can't hold everybody to today's standards because they're always changing too. So I don't know. It's one thing to think that George Washington is a bigot and prolonged slavery, and you know, one could make the argument that the Civil War was partially on him for not helping solve this issue. But again, you look at the other countries around. Look at Venezuela. Look at Colombia. Look at these fledgling Bolivia. Look at all these fledgling South American countries compared to where we are today. We are here today, like, America's the superpower, and we wouldn't be here without George Washington. We wouldn't have this status. He set the precedent, especially with term limits, especially, you know, it's always funny, John Adams wanted to call him uh, Your Highness, or I believe that was it, Your Highness. And he was like, you know what? Just call me Mr. President. That's all I want. I don't want any kingly anything. Let's keep it down. Almost reminds me of how, like, in the Roman world, if you were a king, you were the first man, the first of men. You weren't looked at. They didn't want to try to make you. You sort of took a humble approach, and I'm just another man, but I'm the first man. You know, I'm not Your Highness. You don't bow down. Eventually, of course, they move on to getting more royal and all that. But it's just an interesting look at George Washington. So just a couple thoughts I had. So there you go.